So maybe we could start, Mike. First of all,
Mhm.
thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today about this topic of autistic masking. Um,
Yes.
Maybe you could start off by introducing yourself and telling anyone who's listening why it was that you chose to write about autism.
Well, I'm Mike Westwood here. I reside in Mansfield, Massachusetts. I am a big proponent of autism awareness and education, advocating because I am a person living on the spectrum myself, and I've dealt with various barriers and challenges related to the autism spectrum throughout my life. Technically, at age 9, when I was diagnosed with the former Asperger's label, now it's just autism spectrum disorder. But regardless, I've dealt with a lot of the nonsense involved, the lack of education, people, being at times not as kind as they could be, but that's education. And I think spreading education about it through my blog posts is a necessity to be able to get people to be more inclusive and supportive of it.
So, in terms of the things that the behaviors that you've been encouraged to mask, what are some of those behaviors? What do they look like?
Very good question, Aurelia, and I can demonstrate a couple of them right here. So one of the most common autistic tendency that I've been encouraged since I was 9 to modify is this. The autistic community calls it stimming or self-stimulating. My family, immediate relatives, regardless, have called it flapping since I was flapping since I was 2, as I alluded to in my blog post, but I've been doing this, whether all these motor movements are part of the repertoire being on the spectrum, because what's happening when this is happening with me and any other autistic person that flaps is that we're processing so much our sensory overloading that we flap to get the stimulated energy out of our brains, out of our bodies. So while it looks a little unusual, unexpected, atypical, regardless, I flap like this when there's different forms of the flapping. So I could either go like this or this, depending on how intense the thought process is. But if I, for instance, was going into a grocery store and a train station doing this, I could get people going like I have since I was a kid. And unfortunately, when that occurs, so that's where the modification you alluded to, Aurelia, stems from. I've been encouraged to self-control since ever since I can recall.
Okay.
I see.
Um, how often does how often do you feel like you're in situations where you're wanting to um, do behaviors like the flapping? Like, how often in the day does that happen? How often do you find that you're having to mask things?
I mask most of the time and all really in public because that's what the suggestion has been. Because if I'm in privacy, I can, as a person I work with says, I can flap to my heart's content or flap away in privacy in my home. But if I'm in public, it's generally been suggested and recommended to me to keep it this decreased or however I choose to, such as a stress ball, a fidget spinner, or anything of that nature. I can, because it's known that autistic people can self-control the flapping, stimulated movements to a minimum most of the time, except if they're more on the spectrum in a more pervasive manner, then it's harder for them. But for a person that can be who's cognizant and self-aware and can learn to modify it, it's just by neurotypicals and any way to modify it as much as I can.
Do you have a preference in terms of stimming? Would you say that flapping would be more preferred over something like a fidget toy or those that you mentioned?
Good question, Sam, and answer it. Both could be effective. The flapping is good most of the time for my natural way, or the fidget spinner could be effective. But as far as the flapping, that's just I'm of the big belief that autistic people shouldn't have to mask those behaviors. That's what I try to allude to in the blog for May last month now. I disagree with this. Make the autistic people learn the so-called social norms and expectations to be able to look as much like anybody else or fit in as much as they can. I think that autistic people have their functioning purposes for doing the flapping and other related behaviors. So when they're being suggested by the therapists and clinicians to, you should not do that, it should be recommended to keep that decreased. It makes me cringe a bit because I am of the total opposite opinion as an autistic person. That's an appropriate solution to address that.
And are there therapists and providers who share that opinion? And is there a movement now to be more accepting of autism? in general, would you say?
To answer your first question, really, I think that a lot of, if the question is there, are the therapists and specialists recommending the autistic be more the authentic and let the behaviors on display? That depends on the clinician, because some have been more, people will think things about it, so modify it. Others have been more, the bottom line is I've been recommended, it's my prerogative, whatever I do with the flapping, for instance, but I've been given forewarning about people being judgmental in reaction to it, no matter if I choose to or not. So I have that cross to bear burden to live with anyway. And to answer your second question, Aurelia, as far as more acceptance of autism, not yet. I think it's getting better and it's progressed, and there's awareness groups and advocating groups out there to make that more supported. But as far as general social acceptance, I wouldn't say that's been accepted, but I define that just yet.
Do you find that with social media bringing more awareness to, everything from autism to even ADHD awareness and everything like that, do you find that that has definitely helped in the last, I would say maybe decade of social media being around?
I think both that, and I think it's been social media has afforded more opportunities for misinformation and more misjudgment about it to be spread, as much as acceptance. I think it's a multifaceted part of that, that a lot of the information going about it is good and beneficial and salient for acceptance. But I also think that with the social media being how it can be misinformation and inaccuracies, I think it's opened the room for a lot of people that are critical and cynics about it to not be as kind and spread and be imposters to autistic people and make that acceptance more harder to come by.
For sure.
What do you think? What do you think that people could do in general to be more accepting? What advice would you give the general public if you were going to give them advice on how to better support autistic people?
I think that the general population, as far as accepting autistic people, I think that if they see someone with that noticeably might be on the spectrum doing the behaviors like the flapping, for instance, I think that it would be beneficial to not automatically jump to the conclusion, as I had to deal with, that they're intellectually challenged in that way or special needs, excuse me. And I think that the way to be more inclusive in general is to try not to be as judgmental as possible upon seeing the person on the spectrum doing their tendencies, because that's how a lot of this miscommunication comes and makes it worse than it needs to be. So the general neurotypical population, I think, maybe you could research autism more often and see this person may be doing this because of being on the spectrum, and we're not going to automatically be harsher on them and misjudge them, make them feel inferior to us as the people that are on the spectrum, non-autistic, if you will. The neurotypicals could always be more informed, be more educated, and people on the spectrum could also learn to go about my blog another way. People on the spectrum like me could learn to more appropriate self-advocating skills so that we could educate people that are neurotypical more on why we do what we do and how we feel. Like there's been a bit of disrespect for no reason going around about that for a long time. Yeah.
That's a great answer.
Thank you.
For advocating for yourself, what would you recommend in terms of someone being on the spectrum? What would you say would be a very helpful line to use for, say, if you have a professor and you want to let them know, hey, I'm on the spectrum, certain types of assignments make me uncomfortable, or in the workplace, how would you say someone should advocate for themselves?
Oh, good question. I'm going to approach this from my perspective. I cannot speak for every other person on the autism spectrum in the community here. I can only speak for myself. In my experience, my college assignments were not that impacted by my own diagnosis of ASD. But what I did do was I went up and did the disclosure to a number of professors who responded with a range of okay, do I understand, or anything like that. So it was a matter of whom you asked, how you bring it up is important, because the majority of people think that it shouldn't be an excuse not to do as much as a neurotypical can do in the same classroom environment, which I understand. I think everyone agrees on that. So what I did was I disclosed in a way that I can do the same work as my neurotypical counterparts. But then there's also certain behaviors in the classroom I had to modify, and I got made aware of that on certain occasions, depending on what the day was. But to answer your original question, Sam, I think that self-advocating is important, and I think that autistic people and neurotypical people will play a part in making sure that self-advocating goes as smoothly as it can.
For sure. There's a good answer.
And in terms of what advice you would have for members of the autistic community, um, you mentioned in your blog post that you were diagnosed with Asperger's when you were 9. So, with all of the life experience that you've had since that time, what advice would you have for your younger self and for other listeners who are in some way neurodivergent?
I would say to my younger self, other neurodivergent folks, Aurelia, try to, even though to my younger self, I'd say this is going to be tougher for a bit because for the period of time, like intermediate school, high school, and the beginning of college, you're not always going to have understanding and accepting people out there that'll understand it totally the way your family would. So I say to my younger self, be patient with yourself. You're going to get to this point where you're going to be understood better than you were as a kid or child, regardless, and it'll be all right. And don't think of things in the most dire, catastrophic way because it's not necessary and it's not realistic either. Because you'll know you'll get better at this and it'll get easier to deal with over time. And as far as other neurodivergent people that are my younger self, I'd say everyone. This is going to be a complicated process for everyone. We all need to band in a community here need to band together and realize that people are not used to interacting with us as a neurodivergence in a way that they would understand as well as ourselves could. So we're gonna have to try our best here to make it work. And if it's not effective, then other methods can be implemented to try to make sure it does work eventually.
Sure.
For our
But Liz,
listeners who want to learn more about autism and the concept of autistic masking, are there any blogs or articles or podcasts which you would point them towards?
I would point any listeners and readers to the Anvaya Feats website where I have two in my current one of my May blog posts. I have two different resources related to autism education through Autism Speaks, and another one that's based out of Australia, I believe it was, that I found that it talked about communication strategies for autistic folks and children and adults alike. And I would recommend the readers look at those thoroughly because there's good information in both. And also, as far as podcasts, I've on my LinkedIn, because I have a LinkedIn profile here, I've seen an Adulting on the Spectrum podcast where adults can talk about how they're doing their best to navigate life as an autistic and neurodivergent person. And adulting and doing things as an adult is harder, but harder does not mean impossible here or ever. So, they do their best, and the podcast is Adulting on the Spectrum is a good way to try to get information and try to get the insight to an autistic person living on the spectrum in today's world.
Definitely great resources to look into. And your blog posts are extremely insightful and very interesting to read, especially for people who are on the spectrum, because a lot of people can relate to your struggles for sure.
Yeah,
And I know that you and I have previously talked about masking and how it can affect everyday lives. And I do really appreciate that you're bringing awareness to what people are calling on social media, unmasking. I think that's a really good
right.
thing to bring up and definitely something that we haven't heard a lot about for the past few years. It's kind of a more newer concept, I want to say. What are some
Right.
things you've done yourself to try and unmask? You mentioned flapping before. Are there any other behaviors you can think of?
This is more of it's a good question, Sam, and this is more of I am also living with the spectrum with anxiety and OCD a little bit as well here, so it's three different ones of the same person. So what do you do? But I have unmasked a bit. I've tried to unmask, but I'm so through the anxiety, neurotic and paranoid about unmasking that it's often harder because I have to be able to be vulnerable, let my guard down, and if I want to do any of those behaviors, I am so conditioned to expect unexpected reactions to that. So it's been unmasking for an autistic person that's not as aware. That's easier because they don't have the same level of stress I do about the higher level awareness that I do. So every person on the spectrum, as we know, is different in their own level of the spectrum, whether it's higher or what I call the level that the Rain Man character would be on here. So I try my best to just minimize the behaviors for now. And if a little bit of bold moments comes out, I have to be prepared for whatever reaction unfolds and react accordingly because I can't control other people's reactions. I can't control my own. So that's another aspect to be aware of for me.
and how do your family and your friends respond to you unmasking?
Good question, Aurelia. And they react. My brother, my mother, my father, my aunts, uncles, cousins, all of them are so used. That's Mike B. That's Mikey is my nickname at home, by the way. I know you guys know me as Mike or Mike W on Discord, but it's Mikey to my family. So they are just so used to it after 30 years, because I'm 30 years old. All of my family is so used to it that they just accept it. Other people, strangers and friends have been a little more judgmental at first and then got to know my personality and have been more accepting after that. But my family just knows it's Mike being Mike, and we just let him most of the time do what he wants, privacy, and we'll work around it.
Okay.
This is a bit of a curious question. Have you had friends who you've noticed have very similar experiences to you who are also on the spectrum? I noticed that in terms of myself being on the spectrum, OCD and what used to be called Asperger's is more, I would say, lower support needs. We noticed that around friends who are also on the spectrum, they tend to, I would say, unmask more easier since we know the struggles of each other. Do you have a friend group, or have you experienced that people who have similar experiences to you, you don't feel the need to mask, or is it something that's more of an innate nature?
Good question, Sam. And it's an innate nature. I don't have many other friends who are on the spectrum. I've mostly, a very ironic twist, I've been progressing enough over the years where I've made friends with mostly neurotypical people. And those friends have been surprisingly to me from my younger years to college, for instance.
Mm.
I managed to make friends with other, as my family says, NTs, because that's the initials for neurotypical that we abide by. And my neurotypical NT friends have been way more understanding after they like me for who I am, where they've been encouraged. I've been encouraged in different social scenarios to try to not flap or whatever, but it's been a combination of both. It's been you can flap if you want around us because we know you. And it's been a combination of if I'm like, for instance, if I'm sitting at a cafeteria table in college and I'm flapping like this with a friend's face right next to me, he's asking me, I try to keep that down. I don't want to get hit because my dad has said the same thing. When I have my wrestling, I'm a big professional wrestling fan. That's my specialist area, but related to the ASD. So I've had situations at home, not even in school or college, where I was flapping in an intense way because of the wrestling stimulating me. And my dad said, Mike, can stop a little. I'm afraid I'm going to get hit by your arms if you flap too much. So that's an example of where it's appropriate that I'm on, even though I personally would rather not. But if I'm in a social scenario, that's where it could be a consequence to someone else and a consequence for me. So that's where I've been modifying it for that reason. Yes.
What's the topic for your next blog post?
Good question, Aurelia. In that June, I've already figured out June and July. June is going to be autistic people's lack of understanding of proper, appropriate humor and sarcasm, because a lot of autistic people miscommunicate what their intention is with sarcasm and humor and being facetious, I'd say. And a lot of neurotypicals, especially when I was in middle school, took my humor because autistic people, if you guys were unaware, and I'll be educating here too a little bit, have a symptom where they have the flat robotic pitch and how they sound. There's no intonation or inflection in their voices. So I've been misinterpreted over the course of my life as people think I'm being a wise guy or smart, what, when I'm trying to be funny or in a kind-hearted, humorous way, in a way, make a joke. But people have taken as being a wise guy, unfortunately. So I'm going to write June's blog post about autistic people not getting sarcasm and humor or not receiving in the intended way by a neurotypical, and the fact that they may not communicate sarcasm the way a neurotypical would due to that low robotic pitch in the voice that's part of the ASD symptoms. And then Aurelia, July is going to be about the big thing I have an issue with myself that I'm working on to this day, the black and white thinking. So autistic people often interpret the world around them as being very rigid or the black and white logic. My mother taught me this as a kid, that autistic people see there's no black and white with your Asperger's. Now, autism spectrum disorder, it's black and white in your logic. There's no in between, where the majority of the world sees things in the more shade of gray. Autistic people are very this way, that way, rigid. It can't be both, even though it is. But autistic people have a symptom where they see it for one way or the other, and I had to learn that, and I'm still doing that. So July's blog post will be about the black and white thinking, and this one's will be with the sarcasm, humor part.
That's so exciting. I can't wait to read them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
I'm very thankful for you for writing them.
I appreciate that, Sam. And one clarifying question for both of you. Did I talk a little acceleratingly faster? Did you understand what I was saying in an articulate way, I hope?
You were perfect.
I was going to say there'll be an option to slow down the audio sound.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that I myself was talking in a way that you could understand because I tend to talk quicker when I'm getting animated or vocal when I'm getting passionate, so excuse me.
I'll tell you something funny. I'm from Ireland, and
Yes.
in Ireland, everyone talks really, really, really fast. So for me, I wouldn't even noticed it.
I get self-conscious out of the anxiety paranoia part, Sam, so I brought it up to make sure I'm presenting myself to people that I'd ever met in this case, so I wanted to make sure it was good enough.
It was great. You did great.
Thank you.
But I don't know if I have any more questions.
I
Do you
think
have more questions?
I think that's everything. You really covered the broad scope of everything, and I even appreciated that you're going into what your next blog post will be about, since this was kind of like a little bit of a sneak peek of, for people who do want to learn more about autism and especially your experience. I think it was a good,
Yeah.
very good starter. And if you'd be happy to come back in the future as you work on these blog posts, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much for talking with us, and I hope we can talk to you
Thank you.
again about your next blog post.
I'd love to, Sam. I appreciate that opportunity to do this again. And I got less vocal than I thought I would, considering the subject matter today. But it was a good talk, and I appreciate the both of you. And I thank you for your time and for having me the platform to talk about this. It was good today.
Thank you so much. It was great. It was great, and I learned a lot. And I'm sure anyone.
Thank you, Aurelia. Yeah.
Thank you.
We will see you on Discord and beyond, so take care.
Bye, Sam. Bye, Aurelia. Thank you for your time again, and have a good weekend now.
Thanks for watching. You can connect with us on LinkedIn or visit us online at www.anvayafeats.org, where you can learn more about our different projects and make a donation. Thanks again.